Welcome. I'm Alan Cohen, and this is a Quarantine Interviews. Today, I have a great guest for you. He's an engineer, a producer. He's worked with some of the top names in the industry, including Joe Cocker, Keith Richards, George Clinton, the Manhattans, Ricky Lee Jones, David Ruffin, and Eddie Kendrick. He's also worked with the Pretenders, Bruce Springsteen. Hey, he grew up with Bruce Springsteen. John Mellencamp, Sting, The Pretenders, and the list goes on, including Whitney Houston, the all great. His name is Dan Grigsby. Dan is a good friend of mine. We work together in a school called IAR, Institute of Audio Research, and I'm just touching base with him now. Let's say hello to Dan Grigsby. Hey, Dan, how are you today?
I'm good, Alan. How are you?
I'm doing good. How's that intro? I chewed it up a little bit, but I have to practice more. But it's great to see you. It's great to see you.
That's all right. You made me sound really good.
Yeah. Now we'll get
I have to say, to qualify some of those things, most of those big names, it was my involvement with them was from the engineering side, not from the production side.
Okay.
And some of those big names were I was lucky enough to get credit with because they were part of a album called Jimmy Iovine's Very Special Christmas, which is there were several of those releases. I worked on the first one along with a lot of other really talented engineers and musicians and bands. So that was kind of lucky for me for my resume because it was like one-stop shopping. I worked on one record, and there are all these wonderful names,
Yeah. I mean, some of the top names ever. So that was with Jimmy Iovine, of course. Jimmy Iovine from Interscope Records went on to work with Apple. I'm not sure where Jimmy is right now. Is he still with Apple? Do you know anything about Jimmy?
I have no idea. I really don't.
Well, he's an entrepreneur from the music industry, and he's been all over the place. So just working with a guy like that, once again, is great for your resume and great to be part of that kind of, production. Is terrific. So let me ask this a little bit, just so that our audience knows a little bit more about you. How did you really get into engineering? What brought you into that field itself?
Well, I first went to college. I grew up in the late 60s and 70s, and part of that whole scene, not that I participated in it, but I was a young teenager. So it was really the music industry and musicians, that art form was so influential at that time to anybody coming up. So yes, as a youngster, I was always a music fan. I was lucky because my parents were supportive. I mean, there was a time when I was in almost, fresh sophomore year in college kind of thing, or whatever, like when you're going to get a real job.
You get a real job, right?
Yeah. But then when I got my first couple of platinum records, it was like, oh, well, yeah, I guess you do have a real job. But I was a big music fan, always growing up.
Play an instrument also? Did me tell you play instruments too?
Yeah. Yep. Originally a drummer. I play a little bit of guitar. Actually, today, part of my lockdown, you find all these little jobs to do around the house. Yeah. I got two acoustic guitars, a Gibson and a Martin, that haven't had the strings changed in literally 15 years. Wow. So I ordered strings from Sweetwater. They came yesterday. So this morning I changed the strings on the Martin. Then after this, I'll change the strings on the Gibson. But yeah, play a little bit of acoustic guitar, but mostly drums and percussion.
Great. So obviously back then when you first started, I remember when I first started recording, my first thing was I finally got a stereo Tascam or something, and I put it in the closet of my bedroom. And I had the speakers, one on this side, one on that side of the room. And it was so unbelievable to hear stereo from growing up with mono as a kid, younger, that I drop a penny on that side, the phone would ring on that side, and it was like stereo. Man, you had that kind of epiphany yourself when, learning with the first recording,
Yeah, I mean, it's two quick stories that
yeah.
reminds me of is one is when I was a really young kid, like 10, 11 years old. Um, I got this great idea with my friend Kenny, who lived up the street, who's now retired. He was a professor and he taught English literature and learning technology. When I used to write to him in college, he's about 4 years older than me, 3 years older than me. But I'd write to him in college. He would write me back, but he would include my letter corrected in red.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, I got this great idea with my friend Kenny, and I said, listen, for Christmas, I got a great idea. I'm going to ask my parents for this little tape recorder. It was a German made. It might have been a Vox. I forget. Just a mono tape recorder. And I said, you ask your parents for one too. And what we'll do is we'll record on mine. Then I'll play mine back, and we can play along with it and record onto yours. And
You're doing overdubbing at 11?
Yeah, so I thought it was a great idea. I thought, little did I know, Tom Dowd and those guys already, and Les Paul already had a 4-track tape machine. I didn't know anything about that. All I know is I heard records, vinyl.
That's incredible stuff.
So I thought, wow, what a great idea. See, this is going to catch on.
Too bad it doesn't on it.
I mean, the recordings were terrible, but to us, it was just so much of an accomplishment to be able to overdub with the previous recording. And we'd have to find the right distance for the microphone and the right volume for the playback on the other thing, you know what I mean? Just to get it the best we could. And where to stand in the room if you were too loud. Back up, you're too loud, get back, all of that stuff.
So you do all that stuff. That's crazy at such a young age. So, I mean, you mentioned Tom Dowd and Les Paul. I mean, of course, there's some of the greatest innovators of the recording industry. Do you look up to people like that? Did you ever work with any of those guys, or,
I never did have the opportunity to meet either one of them. I did see Les Paul perform at the Iridium, but I never really got to meet him. But my epiphany with stereo, however, not to change the subject, but was, being a big music fan, I listened to records all the time. I used to get all the 45s, right? And I remember when my parents first got a household stereo, right? It was one of those TV, radio, turntable, console things all in one, right?
Right. That was the furniture. That became like part of the furniture, right?
Oh, yeah. And it was a color TV, it was like, the first people on the block, color TV, oh my God, right? But so I'd play my 45s on that because it was stereo. And I began to realize that the left channel, which sometimes, like if I listened to old Otis Redding records, Motown stuff, or Beatles was a big eye-opener, right? On the left channel, you'd have things like drums, bass, or lead vocal.
Yeah. And
then when you pan it to the right, it was like guitar, background vocals, and the solo or something.
Yeah.
But when you panned it in the middle, it would seem to work. I didn't know those records were made when everything was mono. So what happened on their 2-track tape machines when they mixed down, whatever was on track, channel 1, it didn't matter. And what was on channel 2 didn't matter because it was all going to be a mono record played back on a mono record player, right? In mono radios, mono speakers on cars. So it didn't really, there was no concept of left and right.
Yeah.
So I'm listening and I'm like, oh my God. And that's how we used to learn how to play the songs. We pan it one way and we would just hear the vocal parts or the guitar part, and then you pan it the other way, you hear the drum and the bass part. But it influenced me to the point that even today, when I mix a record, I pan things in a little bit of a wacky way. Well, I might put things off to the left or to the right that other people might not, normally do. But the idea is that when it's all playing back in stereo, it works.
Right.
And later on, as I learned what that was all about, it just made me really have a lot of respect for engineers like Jeff Emmerich, who recorded all those Beatle tracks.
Sure.
And then, when you find out they only had a 4-track tape machine, you're like, oh my God, you got to be kidding me, But yeah, people like Tom Dowd were influenced and like I idolized. Later on, later on there was people. In the beginning, was engineers that I was admired a lot, like Tom Dowd and Jeff Emmerich. A little later on, Jim Bonifant, who was like my mentor when I started out. He was the engineer and then became the producer for Kool and the Gang. And then, I know I'm missing some people here and there, but there were people like that I wanted to emulate. And then later on, it was people that were producers like Rick Rubin and Don Was and Daniel Lenoir.
Wow. So they were your influences, or did you work with them as well?
No, I never got to work with them, but I worked with Jim. I worked with Jim Bonifant for many years.
Yeah.
But I didn't work. John, a guy named John Rollo. I worked with him for a while when I was coming up and learning. He was a British engineer producer. Worked with the Kinks.
Okay, and then you went to school for engineering originally.
No, I never went to school.
Oh, tell me about Monmouth County University.
Monmouth College. I went to Monmouth College because it was 1974.
Yeah.
And your parents said, okay, the music is one thing, but you need something to fall back on. And I was like, well, there's a couch, there's a bed. So I went to college, and in high school I was influenced by an artist, but he wasn't a musician. He was an art teacher, painter. Mr. Schnall was his name. So I thought, wow, his descriptions of art and what an artist's job is, and how to present your artwork and how to be creative, really influenced me a lot. And I took that and put it into the music, But in the beginning, I thought, well, wow, maybe I could be an art teacher. If I have to have something to fall back on, being an art teacher wouldn't be terrible. Right?
Well, and then what do you fall back on after you do an art?
Yeah.
That's a double fallback.
Yeah, right. But I mean, as a teacher, I thought an art teacher,
Right.
So, not an artist. Like, I'm not going to move to France and starve and drink absinthe and paint pictures.
Put on a beret and all that stuff.
Yeah, right. So I went to school. I was gonna go for art education, but at that time, Monmouth College was in Long Branch, New Jersey, just a stone's throw from Asbury Park. And at that time, the music scene at the Jersey Shore was just beginning to explode.
Yes.
The E Street Band. You had Southside Johnny. You had bands like Cahoots. Cold Blast and Steel. There were so many great ones. The Shakes, the Shots. There were so many bands that were like Blue Eyed Soul or just Jersey Shore R&B. It was really great. And so I started hanging out more at places like the Stone Pony and Mrs. J's, which was like a beer garden. There used to be a biker joint. As a matter of fact, the dressing room from the Stone Pony had a little window that opened up to the kitchen in the bar next door, which was the pizza joint. So you'd bang on the window, and the guy would open the window and goes, "Give me a couple of slices, would you?" Oh, no problem. Before you went out of just. But anyway, it was just a really good time because everything was exploding. The music was just exploding. It was like a musical renaissance at the Jersey Shore.
Right.
And of course, later on, You had bands like, Bon Jovi and so forth coming. But
So, did you get into that scene now? Were you becoming part of the scene itself, working there, or meeting these the great artists that you're referring to?
I would from time to time do live sound. I worked at the radio station at Monmouth College, and I started doing a concert series, and I started doing a live show on once a week, where the radio station was built in a sort of like a circle, and you had studios around the outside of a common space that was in the middle, and that was meant to be a conference room. And it was all glass. So from whatever studio you were in, you could see into the other studios and see into the center common space. Well, I grabbed a couple of guys. We took the conference table out of there. We set up a soundboard. We got mic stands and microphones. And we would have bands come and set up in that room and broadcast live. And it was all original music. And then we'd interview the band and talk about original music and their influence, stuff like similar to what you're doing now. But it was all recorded on tape and then played back at another time, right? So we could edit it, for content and so forth. But yeah, it was a great time. And that's what I meant. Like the Jukes, Southside Johnny, who I still think is one of the greatest crooners. I mean, I love that guy's voice.
Yeah.
He's right up there with Sinatra and Bing Crosby and Perry Como with me. I mean, the crooner's voice, on a barroom side of things. Yeah, I get it, but still, what a great singer.
Yeah.
And the energy that is Bruce Springsteen. I mean, God, that needs no introduction. That guy gives 150,000%. My friend Elaine works at Monmouth College. Eileen, I'm sorry. Works at Monmouth College. She's involved with the Springsteen archives down there. Because now they have a Bruce Springsteen archive at Monmouth College. And they also have the NARIS, the Grammy Museum there too.
Oh, they do? I didn't know that. That's terrific. All right, so those are some great names. You're getting into the scene. You're starting to meet people. How did you really break into a professional situation as being an engineer producer as you are now?
It's being in the right place at the right time. I tell all the young people all the time, I mean, it's great what the digital technology has done, that so many people now have a voice and that you can work from home. But the downside for me is always that you don't get to interact with other great minds and with people who've gone before you. I mean, you were around that time. I mean, I'd go to the Hit Factory, the power station. Next thing you know, you're drinking a cup of tea with John Lennon, or you're drinking a cup of tea with Jimmy Iovine or Phil Ramone. I mean, you'd meet people.
Yeah.
And even if it didn't lead to a gig, which most of the times it did, even if it didn't lead to a gig, you learn from the way they presented themselves, the way they handled themselves, the way their work ethic, the way they did things. You picked up all of this information. You can't get that sitting at home in your bedroom working on a DAW.
Right.
I'm not criticizing it. I think it's great. There's so many talented people that otherwise would not have had a voice, but you miss that. You miss that being in the right place at the right time. And that's what happened. I would be one of those guys that sat in the studio with my mouth shut and my eyes open and watch. And then one day the engineer turned and say, "Hey, Dan, go out and move that microphone for me." "Sure, no problem." Boom, you run out there, you move the microphone, you run back in. It's like always reminding me of those kids on the tennis courts, with the ball, they run, they get the ball, and they run back the other. You used to do that because the idea was not to hold up the session. What was important was whatever creative moment was happening. Anything that slowed that down was a problem. So next thing I know, it's not just go move a mic, it's get another mic, plug it in, change tapes for me, flipped it because it was 2-inch tape at the time. Next thing is, hey, would you record this for me? Well, I tweak this. So yeah. One thing led to another, and then the engineers that you worked with as an assistant would realize that you were serious and trustworthy and truly passionate about it like they were, and one thing led to another, and the next thing you know, I'm engineering.
So what was some of those early gigs? I know you mentioned Kool and the Gang and Joe Cocker. How did you get to meet names like that?
I was working at a studio called the House of Music, which was in West Orange, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
Owners Charlie and Irene Conrad. Charlie has since passed, God bless, but actually, I should back up. I started at a small little studio in Roseland, New Jersey, called The Sanctuary.
Mm.
And Joe Borges and Vito, Joe and Vito were the owners of this studio. And Joe had a band called The Watch, which was a very popular band in New Jersey for a while. But they both put their money in. They were both musicians, and that was their love, and they started this little studio. And I had another friend who was recording there. So I went up to watch because, I was already involved in radio, working in radio, but I always preferred the idea of making records instead of playing records, right? So I go and love at first sight. It's great. They had an old Ampeg MM 1000 tape machine, or something, and 2-inch tape, 16-track. First, they had an 8-track, half-inch machine.
Half-inch.
Reel to reel.
Yeah, yeah.
And then they upgraded, and they got the 2-inch, 16-track machine. But, so I went and started going there.
16 was 1-inch. We went to 2-inch was for the 24.
There was 2-inch 16, too.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I had a Tascam. I guess the next professional level up would be a 1-inch, 2-inch. Yeah.
Yeah, and then what they did is instead of you couldn't make tape any wider, right? So they just made new heads. So you could have 16-track heads or 24-track heads, but the tape was the same size. So I would go there and do anything, take out the garbage, clean the place up, make coffee, move it, and then they'd give me a break. They gave me my shot to engineer. And then through this other mutual friend, Jim Bonifant came up one time. And so he said, hey, if you ever want to, a shot at a big studio, if you want to try to get in, I work at House of Music. I'm chief engineer, come check it out. And I said, yeah. I was there like the next day. And then again, one thing led to another. And a lot of big names would come into that studio. Jim was working with Cool and the Gang, so once they felt I was ready, I was able to work on those sessions.
Right. And what other names were you working on at the time?
They did a lot of gospel records. So I remember working with BB and CC Winans.
Sure.
Twisted Sister would play in there, although I didn't get on that record at all, but it was in that studio. Actually, funny story. One day, the studio manager, who was the co-owner, right, Irene Conrad, calls me into her office and she says, I have a dilemma. Said, I wish you had a double so I could put you on both sessions, but I've got 2 important sessions going on and I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to put it to you, which one you want to work on. So I said, okay, well, what are they? And she said, well, one is Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones is coming in and record a solo record. I said, okay. And I said, well, what's the other one? She says, the other one is a spec deal that just got signed that an artist that we've been developing here at the studio. And they just got signed to a really great deal. And they're called the Fugees. I said, the Fugees? What's that? Sounds like a candy bar with almonds, the Fugees. I said, I'll work with Keith Richards. Worst mistake. Not a worst mistake. I loved working with Keith Richards, but had I worked with the Fugees, that was a big hit. You never know. I tell young ones all the time, never know which one is going to break and be the big hit. Look at them like they're all a hit.
And you're saying you picked the wrong one. I'm saying, oh yeah, play with Keith Richards.
Yeah, well, at the time, I didn't know the Fugees. And there was a guy who I met also at that studio called Sanctuary Um, um, oh, I feel stupid for not. I know his name. I know his name.
Hey, don't worry, he's not watching. I didn't invite him.
All right. He might. He's probably on LinkedIn. Warren. Warren was his name. Great engineer. Great engineer. And I brought him into House of Music, introduced him, whatever. And then he took it from there. But really great engineer. And I said, Irene, Warren's awesome. At the time he was assisting me a little bit here and there and doing sessions in there and, trying to, establish a niche for himself, as we all do. And so Warren got the Fugees, and then the rest was history. Next thing I knew, Warren's like, hey, Madonna's calling me, Aerosmith is calling. I was like, oh my God, you lucky bastard.
Well, it's an interesting.
He deserves it. He's a great guy, great engineer, talented.
Yeah, let me just say that's a very interesting point for some of our listeners and our young engineers that be listening to this. It was back then we did do a lot of spec deals where you don't know. I mean, you might get a few dollars up front. A lot of times I was also a private studio owner. A lot of times I do it as a speculative, where you're not really getting paid, but you're going to get a point on the record or you're going to get notoriety on the record. And then if the record does well, of course, you go along with it. Same here with the Fugees. You didn't know it. You picked the name. So you don't know where it's going to go. And I work with a guy that did a spec deal writing a song. These guys came to the studio. The next thing he knows, I was playing with him with the Cadillacs. We were in Atlantic City. Next thing you know, he says, oh, the spec deal I did, it's in this new movie called Dirty Dancing. I helped write the bridge to I Had the Time of My Life.
Oh, my God.
That was the last time I ever saw Donnie Markowitz. The rest is history. He picked the right spec deal. So you mentioned two important points, and then we'll go on. I want to get to your latest stuff. Is one, of course, doing spec deals where you don't know what they're going to be, but you have a good hunch to do it. The other thing is doing a lot of the stuff that you did in the studio, starting out as an intern or the assistant is very important for the upcoming. I mean, doctors become interns, but in the music industry, such as yourself, you had to do a lot of interning, be humble, and be at the right place at the right time. So very, very interesting points that you brought up for our younger upcoming engineers.
Even as a producer, right? It's the same sort of, there's the same sort of mentality you need to adjust yourself to. Often, and you don't get to work with other producers like, Rick Rubin or, Quincy Jones. I mean, my God, the producer's producer, right?
Sure.
So you don't get to experience that, the attitude, the protocol, the knowledge, the tricks of the trade, right? If you were going to be a carpenter or a mason or a mechanic, your work is underneath a master at that craft.
Yeah,
and that's to prepare you for it. Music used to be the same thing in the early days of music. You had a teacher, you lived with that teacher, you worked with that teacher, he taught you. It was like you were his protege until you learned the ins and outs of everything. But for production, you have to, what's hard is that we go into these careers with our own notions and preconceived ideas that we developed, but we developed them as music industry fans, not as music industry participants, not as people were. So there's some things we need to unlearn when we get in there. And by working with people who are already successful and already been there and done that, we get that guidance. We get to unlearn, That's why, for me, I feel like contemporary radio, for the most part, commercial radio, is doing the music fan a great injustice. Because if they do play music and don't have a bunch of knuckleheads talking, if they do play music, it's the same stuff, the same genre, the same songs.
Well, it's all owned by one company, most of the radio stations anyway.
Yeah, we'll say it. Satan. I mean, Clear Channel. Oops. But nevertheless, and you can contest to this as well. When we grew up and listened to the radio, even AM radio, in an hour's time, you got a musical education. You heard everything, especially growing up in the 60s and 70s. You heard rock, folk, R&B, which was rhythm and blues, not what R&B has become today, which is more like pop today, but R&B, pop, right? Crossover country. And the DJs would have a lot of pride in trying to fit song to song to show a common thread, whether it be a lick or the key of a song or the attitude or what the lyric was talking about. There was always some sort of link musically or lyrically from one song to the next. And those DJs that were really good at it became superstars in their own right, but the point is, and that we got this great musical education, I don't know how people before us did it when they had race radio. It's like if you wanted to hear, Ike and Tina Turner or James Brown or Little Richard, you had to listen to a radio station that was just a black run,
right,
African American run radio.
A lot of different genres. So that's interesting. As an engineer, I'm sure you looking at obviously your resume, you worked all different types of music. So you could be doing, a Kool and the Gang or this and that, from rock to every different style. So how do you relate that to your technique of understanding the music in any style? I mean, you may not be a country fan, but if your client is a country artist or they bring them in the studio, you better know how to get the best country sounds or whatever, right?
Well, yeah. Well, luckily for me and for most people my age and older, you had a great influence that came from multiple genres. Mm-hmm. My father was Native American, but he was a country music fan. Hank Williams, Elvis, stuff like that. Not that Elvis was country, but yeah, Merle Haggard, country stuff. So I did have a little bit of taste of the country coming up. And then also, growing up in the 60s, you had bands like Creedence and other bands that tried to mix country and rock and pop together, which is something that keeps music fresh, keeps it, I bring that to my work today, and with some of the young people I teach and so forth, I remind them of the working goal, the model that Def Jam Records set for their time that made them so successful. They took a rock band, Aerosmith, and they took Run DMC and put them together.
Right. That changed history.
So this idea of staying stuck in one genre and just working on hip hop or just working on pop or just whatever it is detrimental, not just to you as a creative individual, but to our art form in general. You need to make stagnant water is not good to drink. You got to keep it moving.
Wow. That's terrific. So just to go, so in your professional career, I mean, you did mention some other names. Do you have another good story, Joe Cocker or somebody else that really was a terrific experience?
Joe Cocker was an awesome person. Yeah, he was nothing like that, all those rumors like, he had cerebral palsy or he didn't have anything. That was just his way. He was getting down and getting with it, But when I worked with him, he was much older, right? He wasn't young.
Great records. What's that song? Beautiful. That's one of his biggest records.
Yeah, that was it was after that.
You are so beautiful to me.
Yeah. And then one night of sin and Unchain My Heart.
Yeah,
it was being produced by Charlie Midnight. And co-produced, I think, by John Rollo, who also engineered. But I got to do all the recording and all the engineering. One while those guys, you know, did the production end of things. So that was a really great experience. I loved that. And Joe was just a gentleman's gentleman. He was so cool. He was just so cool. I remember, God rest his soul, I remember at the time when we were doing those records, he had bought some farmland somewhere. I think it was in Northern California. And they were in the middle, him and his wife were in the middle of figuring out what livestock to buy. So every once in a while, he'd be on the phone out in the lounge. He's like, yeah, get 10 chickens and you know, we could get a milk cow. How about a milk cow? You know, and all this stuff. It was really
I got
cool.
one more take for you, Joe. All right.
Yeah. You know, it was really interesting. You know, as they always say, record everything, right?
Okay. Good.
I would say at least half. Well, no, I would say a little bit less than half of the lead vocals that were on that record, Unchain My Heart album.
Yeah. Record.
Were what we intended to be the reference vocals when the band was cutting the rhythm tracks. I mean, I remember Charlie Midnight, who was producing, who I haven't seen in years because he moved from New York to California, but loved that guy. Have a lot of respect. Really talented guy. We're listening back to the track and we put the vocal on and we're just shaking our heads like, this is great. You know, I mean, there's nothing to change. And Charlie said, yeah, I mean, he sounds like Joe Cocker. What else do you want him to sound like? You know, it sounds like Joe Cocker. So, I mean, it was great, you know. So guys, record everything.
Oh, the great tip. Record everything. Because you don't know. A lot of times you keep doing it over and over, you might burn the artist out. I mean, or they lose that initial. But then I was watching the Quincy thing, and Michael Jackson said on the Quincy one, the sonic sounds of Quincy was that he was a perfectionist. He made you do it over and over. And then even when you thought you had to take, Quincy would say, and Michael said this about Quincy, but can you give me one more? So that I guess there's different schools of the initial take or, like you said, multiple takes and getting that perfection. Where Michael Jackson type of record might be different than that one vocalist of Joe Cocker, where Michael Jackson is a more produced type of record. I don't want to say produced, but
more intricate. There's a lot of phrasing going on. There's a lot of, tiny little things that he does with his voice when he's performing. And I don't know how much of it is rehearsed or how much of it isn't rehearsed. All I know is those records sound great.
Right.
But not only is it dependent on the artist, but there were ways of working throughout the decades, right? And if you think about it, it often goes hand in hand with the way our technology develops.
Okay.
Right? At one point in time, there weren't any overdubs. Everybody played at the same point, at the same time. If somebody messed up, you scrapped the whole recording and you started again, right? Had to get it right, right? Then we had multi-tracks, so we could overdub a little bit. Then we discovered, oh, if I can overdub, then that means, how about more tracks? Now I can do it 10 times and pick the best one, Now with DAWs, you got playlists. You can literally record forever and ever and ever. Some artists love that push. Some artists love that push. Some artists need that push. And part of being a good producer is knowing what technique to use or what way to deal with that performer to get the best out of them. It could come back and bite you, though. I mean, you could push somebody, you wear them out, and you're done for the day.
Yeah. That's true.
So you got to have...
I mean, they're not like playing the guitar. They're doing a vocal, and that's, full energy and the body itself.
When we worked with David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks, David was not of great health. And we literally were worried if he was going to be too ill to work. at some point in time. The executive producers on that record were Daryl Hall and John Oates.
Wow.
Although Daryl I didn't see off, but John came to the studio many times. So what we did is we would make slave tapes. So we'd run a second 24-track machine that just had a 2-track stereo rough mix on tracks 1 and 2. And then we would record every single take of every single thing that came out of David Ruffin's mouth.
Wow.
And then comped it all later. Not that it needed a lot of comping. I mean, the guy was a great performer, David Ruffin, God rest his soul, too. I mean, the voice of a decade, right? I mean, a legend.
Sure.
But on our end, our job was not to anticipate. Our job is to capture, right? Well, our job is to anticipate, but our job is more about capturing, right? We need to get that right performance, no matter how much it takes to do. You know,
sure.
And to edit tape is not like editing in a digital work system today. You know, if I wanted to copy and paste the first chorus on tape, I had to print it to another tape, get the razor blade out, cut that bad boy, splice it in.
Over here, take that one. And then, I put it backwards. Hey, that's a great sound. Keep it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Right.
I forget who it was that once told me, says, genius is sometimes just an uncontrolled accident.
Yeah.
You know, something happened. Oops. Wow, that sounds great, you know.
Well, yeah, that's true. And then some best records, that's what really made that record unique. Something different that happened that was captured by you, the engineer, that let's keep it. Don't change it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, these are some great tips. All right, so you're producing. You're working in the studio, working with big names like that. And then, where'd you go in the career after that? Are you still doing that? I know we met at a school called Institute of Audio Research, IAR. You were there a bit longer than me. So you got into also teaching as one of your professions.
Yeah, I mean, I still do independent studio work, and I do all-inclusive things where I produce it, I record it, I mix it. In some cases, they ask me to master it, but honestly, when it gets to that point, I don't want to master it. Please, let somebody else master it. No offense, but I mean, you know, I'm just like not over it, but it's just like too focused, too, you know. At the end, you're just like so concerned about it. It's like you raise your kid to make it, the kid's going to be whatever the kid's going to be. You can't make the kid something you don't want the kid to be. So mastering it is like nice to let somebody have a fresh ear on it and so forth. I also did some teaching in the CUNY system, City University of New York. Currently, I'm also teaching at the New York campus for SAE. But my first love, of course, is studio work, and
Yeah.
So
do you have your own home studio that you work out of at this time?
Other than my home, the studio that I work out of, which is a walking distance from my house, is East Side Sound with Lou Holtz. He's an old-time New Yorker, Lower East Side, great studio, a lot of good microphones. I believe Stork designed the control room in the studio. Yeah. Sure. And one cool feature he has out in the live room, you know, the cloth that they use for the absorbent walls in studios? Well, he actually contacted Fender and got the person who makes the cloth for the Fender grills on Fender amplifiers. And the whole studio is covered in what looks like Fender grill cloth. It's great. It looks really
it's a unique thing. Yeah.
But, I've worked at a lot of studios. I worked at, back in the day, I worked at Hit Factory. I worked at Power Station. I worked at,
So a lot of these big studios, you mentioned Power Station, obviously they're not there anymore. Some are still in L.A., not as many here in New York.
Electric Lady's still there.
Which one?
Electric Lady.
Oh, Electric Lady. Yeah, I work there as well. Yeah, great studio and, all time. And the mural is still there that Jimmy had painted, or did they finally paint over the wall?
No, I believe it's still there. I haven't been there in several years, but I'm
Yeah.
sure it is.
Right.
They're not going to change that, you know.
They can't change it. No matter how
I
dirty.
remember, not to interrupt you, but Electric Lady story. I did a session Electric Lady one time. We were mixing, and so we go home, come back the next day, and I hit play, and I said, "Boy, this sounds different. Something's changed," you know. And I'm looking, I see there's a few EQ buttons that have been pushed in, and a few because the board had onboard processors and stuff. Dynamic. It's like, so the assistant at the time goes, "Oh, that's Jimmy." Like, what, the ghost of Hendrix comes in and adjusts your mix. Hey, to get more than your money's worth here. He says, no. The studio cat's name is Jimmy. The cat walks on the console at night because it's warm and lays on the console. And sometimes it pushes buttons in. So I left it in the mix. It sounded good. I didn't give the cat any credit though. Fuck that.
Jimmy the cat.
Jimmy the cat.
That's good. All right. So as we're closing out, I mean, obviously I started these quarantine interviews to speak to people like you, some old buddies of mine, or friends, some people I interviewed, some people that I don't know. Really, it was because of, obviously, we're in quarantine. How do you think that's really affecting the music industry at this point? And what do you see coming out of this? Obviously, sessions are becoming, obviously, live playing, if you're doing live sound, any thoughts on that?
Well, a couple of things. The live performance venues and that experiencing of a live performance, being in the audience and being in front of the stage is something that has been being chipped away at in a city like New York. We used to have so many venues to go see live music, and now it's getting to smaller and smaller and smaller. I think this might even end up killing some of those smaller venues. I don't think they're going to come back.
Wow.
On the other hand, this Facebook Live thing and what you're doing on LinkedIn is taking a whole new face. My friend Johnny Hickman, who's in a band called Cracker, on Friday nights does a Johnny Live thing on Facebook Live, acoustic. He does a whole set. You put questions and comments up in the chat, and he sees it. Another Native American. We didn't get to talk about that too much, but another Native American musician and friend of mine, Thea Hopkins. She's a Wampanoag Indian, and she's a folk singer. She's doing the same thing from her living room. She's very interesting, very talented, very bright woman. One of her big breaks was she wrote a song called "Jesus Is on the Wire," and Peter, Paul, and Mary recorded it.
Oh yeah, nice.
So that was pretty cool. But yeah, I think a lot of the technological generation, and I don't mean this in a negative way, so please, folks, don't put those hateful comments up, haven't experienced the live music performance. So what's on Facebook, what's on their handheld device, what is on their computer is their live venue, right? So they don't know what they're missing. But at the same time, it's a natural way of experiencing live music.
It's really live. I mean, it's.
Well, I mean, some people are starting to edit those live things and posting them later, which then I worry a little bit about because it'll be like the video version of Melodyne or something. It's like
Well, what I'm getting
engineer.
from you is, just to start wrapping it up, because you've been in the business so long, and we started with mono, we started with stereo. Of course, we talked about the different inch tapes, and obviously you're into the digital side on Pro Tools right now. And now that we're going into this live streaming and recording and doing this, you really have to embrace the technology, the new technology. For you, as an engineer that's been so successful all this time, obviously taking that new instrument, that new machine, that new technology, embracing it for the future. And then when that goes, there's something right behind it.
Yeah.
Taking that and embrace it. And like you said, what we're doing now with these streaming, why am I doing this? Hey, what else am I going to do? I have to embrace this new technology and what's going on in my environment to stay relative. If I said, "No, I don't go for that phase. I don't go for this type of stuff," then where would I be? So I imagine, to finish us in that is that you really learn to embrace new technology to keep you relevant and to keep you as a professional in a very hard industry.
Yeah, and you want to know what? It's nothing new. You talk to any engineer who's been around the block many times. That was what we did. A new piece of equipment, whether it was analog or digital, came in the studio. You learned it because here's the new latest thing. The H3000 standalone. The EMT 250 digital plate. Whatever it was that came in back in the analog days. It took a lot longer for the technology to evolve because it was analog. With digital technology, it's like every day there's something brand new. But the concept, that idea of learning something new is not something that is strange to audio engineers by any means. We've always embraced the new technology. You have your favorite things, of course, and the things you like to use and the things that create sounds that you like. Yes, of course. But you always were confronted with a new piece of gear, a new microphone, a new console, computer DAW, whatever it is. It's part of our geekdom, our geekism, the stuff that we like the toys,
And every day's just reading another manual. That's when I was young. That's all I did was I got a new thing. I read it inside out. So somebody comes in the room, I know that piece of equipment. So last thing, I did want to touch about two last things because we're running really hard at that clock, is you keep mentioning the Native American stuff because I know you're very involved with Native American music. How did you get involved with that?
Well, I mean, the background is very simple. My father was Native American. Not many people knew it. At the time when he grew up, you didn't tell people you were a Native American.
Wow.
You're kind of proud that you're an Indian. You just be careful who you tell. But my grandmother on my father's side would tell us stories about the Indians and stuff like that. But my father was Native American. My mother was Italian, so Columbus Day was a real hoot and holler in my house. But for the most part, younger, I really embraced my Italian heritage. But then when I got older, I began to more embrace my native side. And I was lucky to meet such great people like John Trudell and Tiokasin Ghost Horse. I was in a band with Tiokasin Ghost Horse. He was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize some years back. But like my attitude towards music, where I love to take, going back to that early experience on the radio, getting exposed to lots of different genres, I like to mix it up. When I produce and engineer stuff, I like to mix not just genres, but instruments that you wouldn't imagine in a rock song or a pop song or an R&B song, and use them in that genre, in an application in that genre. It's like putting, hot peppers on your pizza. It's great, and so I started to incorporate Native American rhythms and Native American instruments. And
Yeah.
everybody just thinks drum and flute, but there's so much about. My master's degree is in something called ethnomusicology, which is the anthropology of music, and my thesis was on Native American traditional music and how it was involved in the development of the blues. The underlying subject here is Native invisibility. Indigenous people are either considered to be extinct or not considered at all. But they have lots of great contributions in just about everywhere, including science, right? So I would take I discovered, where the 4/4 beat came from and where a pentatonic scale came from. And what a lot of people don't realize is that throughout this study, I'm not trying to diminish the African-American contribution. Not at all. I'm just trying to, chase that anthropological, ethnomusicological, that's a tough one, rabbit hole down to find origins. You have to realize that African-American slaves and Native American people shared a cultural experience for hundreds of years. Native American people were taken as slaves from North and South American continent before the first African slave was ever stolen from their land and brought here. It's like the old adage, America was built on stolen Indian land and on the backs of African slaves. So they understood that slave trade. They understood that culture. And they shared, as many cultures do, when they become grouped together, share their art forms, their knowledge of food and land and all that stuff, right? There's a great movie that was out a couple of years called Rumble, Indians That Rocked the World. And they talk about all these Native American musicians and their history and how they contributed to different genres of music. Really fun, really informative. I really recommend anyone to check it out. I'm sure it's on Netflix or something now. Yeah. But anyway, that's where I remember as a kid sitting out, and Granny would be on the rocking chair outside at night, no lights, and it was they had oil lamps to light the house, no electricity. There had one little electric line that came off of a pole, and the only thing that ran was this old tube radio, which was always set at some radio station that would play a mixture of gospel music and old country music. And when she would hear
your description is so intense. I'm visualizing her rocking and this old radio with the speaker,
which was inside the house, but you could see the tubes glow through the window.
What a story, man! Yeah,
and when you'd hear some of those country singers or some of the R&B or the gospel singers sing, and they would do that, oh yeah, that and Grandma would go, you hear that? That's Indian music. Because when he was, all that bending of the phrases and so forth. And the blues wasn't born in Africa; it was born here.
Yeah, right.
By a contribution of Africans stolen from their land, but Indians had a little piece of it. We had a little piece of it. We were there.
Great. I'm glad we went off. I just had to make a left turn before we ended today because we kind of missed that. And I was always intrigued by you telling me, some of these, about that you have that kind of background. So last word of wisdom from you to up-and-coming engineers and space. What do you got to say to close us out?
All I would say is try to fight the normal, natural progression of listening to the music you love only. Try to listen to all different types of music. And to remember, as an engineer or producer, aspiring engineer or producer, I believe your very first job always is to listen. Not to reach for the EQ right away, not to reach for that effects unit right away, not to pump it up and dance around in your seat. Listen. That's the biggie.
I was just listening. I took a
Got it.
I took a moment to listen.
Awesome.
Dan, I have to say I really enjoyed it. I'm sure the listeners are going to really enjoy and learn from your experience. Really, really terrific. I like to say today's interview was with Dan Grigsby, an engineer producer, worked with some of the top names. He's also a certified gold and platinum engineer that really worked with some top names. And your longevity in the business is because when you're in the studio, people want to be there with you. And like you said, you know how to listen to what they need. An engineer's part, of course, is to hold that train, that engine together and make that producer and, of course, the artist shine. So I want to commend you on all your work throughout the years and just being a terrific guy. You know, we always had some camaraderie, and I really enjoy speaking with you today. So
thanks, I appreciate it, bud.
yeah, thank you very much. So to everybody, thank you very much. My name is Alan Cohen, and this was the Quarantine Interviews. Thank you.